whispers and rumors that don't get reported. Stories I write that are often distorted. Got my notebook and pen, and I'm ready to listen. Tell me the truth, I'll consider your position. I've seen killers with eyes so cold and dead, and others go to prison because of what someone said, rotting away for the rest of their lives, leaving a hole here on the outside. Things are sad here on earth, and it's no wonder why, when you consider the sociopaths who remain in charge. It's me who sees the system for all its flaws, and I usually start with the probable cause. My right hand is reading the probable cause. Welcome to The Probable Cause. This is a podcast covering the legal system in Allen County, Indiana, and northeastern Indiana, and sometimes the state of Indiana as well. I'm your host, Jamie Duffy, a local journalist and international journalist at this point. And to my left is our co-host, Michael McAlexander, who is the Allen County Prosecutor. Also contributing most times is my right hand. Unfortunately, my right hand is not feeling well today, and she will not be on the podcast, but we sure hope to get her next week. So today, we're going to explore habeas corpus. Now, I say explore because every time you turn on the TV today, it's in the New York Times. What is habeas corpus? It's something that isn't discussed that often on a daily basis in the U.S., but right now it is. And it's an established part of English and American law, and dare I say, it's the world's guarantee of law and fairness for at least 1,000 years. So, and there are those actually who trace it to the Roman law. So, but first we need to get to the courts. Mike, what do we have in the courts this week?
Not too much. No trials this week, and that may be true for next week as well. Frequently on holiday weeks, there are no major trials going, so the other trials may or may not go, but there's just not a ton of stuff scheduled either week.
Well, we should say that we are at Memorial Day weekend. So the week prior, people are going to be taking off Thursday and Friday. The next week, Mondays, everyone's off, so we know that. I do want to say that last week we had a very high-profile murder trial, and that was for a 35-year-old woman named Allison K. Davis of New Haven, Indiana, which is a part of Allen County. She was acquitted in the death of her husband. She was charged with murder. He was 40. The details of the case are very interesting. The right side of his skull was crushed. There were all kinds of interesting details in that probable cause, which I believe I wrote up or went into extensive detail on. However, she was acquitted. Would love to talk to the jury about it. That's probably not going to happen. And I'm sorry I wasn't here to cover the trial. However, I was in Europe for about 3 to 4 weeks. I went to the courts in Oxford, in England. I went to the courts in Normandy and in Paris. In Paris, the one day that I selected to go to the courts was the day that Kim Kardashian was there to attend her own trial. She was tied up, and these 10 guys stole all her jewels. It was up to about $10 million. But some of the details of that court case really cracked me up. They call them the Papi Braco, or the grandpa robbers. And they got in there and they did all that horrible stuff to her. They're now all in their 70s. This happened in 2016. The one guy who was tasked with taking the jewels out of the hotel where she was had them in a sack. He was on his bicycle, and they all dropped into the street and went all over the place. And some of the jewelry has never been recovered. They did find a diamond cross. It was worth about $100,000. There was her engagement ring from Kanye West. That was a $4 million ring. However, she was there because one of the gentlemen, who's on a cane now, decided that he wanted to apologize to her in person. And she sort of made the most of that media moment, I think. And so I did try and get into that trial, but of course, there was no way I was going to. There were about 500 journalists who were accredited who got into that gallery. So I asked the people there, because they are very welcoming in the French courts, do you have another trial I could attend? And they said, yes, absolutely, we do. And it was a Syrian national who has been accused of committing war crimes between 2013 and 2016 under the Assad regime. However, he was in opposition to Assad. He was at one point a member of the Syrian army, and then he left because of all the horrible things that were going on. And then this group that he was in, Jaish al-Islam, is also accused of committing some absolutely horrific crimes. He was there. I must say that the guy who was testifying in front of the judges, you don't often sit in any trial here in Indiana and hear the words, "after I saw the massacre," which really, I said, oh, well, wait a minute, this really is actually maybe more interesting than what's going on in that other court. And so I did write that up. I want you all to know that these stories are on www.theprobablecause.com. There's about 5 of them from the English and the French courts. And stories. I also got a French judge to pronounce voir dire for me. So if you go on the Probable Cause Facebook page and just take a look at Judge Hugo Riolon, I said to him, and I made him say it twice, so everybody in Indiana is going to know how to pronounce voir dire now. So having said that, I'll go into more of that. I'm sure that's going to be a part of the podcast, some of the things that I saw over there. But let's go to Habeas Corpus. Did you bring your little book today to read out what it is? No, you didn't.
Oh, it's over there on my desk.
Okay. So
I have a pocket Constitution.
It is part of the U.S. Constitution. It preceded the Bill of Rights, okay, which I think is very important. It is for citizens and non-citizens. That's very specific there. And it's in Latin. It means you have the body. We don't talk like that in English, of course, but it's a writ of habeas corpus, generally is a judicial order forcing law enforcement authorities to produce a prisoner they are holding and to justify the prisoner's continued confinement. Would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, this is a right that goes back, as you said, certainly back to early English jurisprudence, nearly 1,000 years ago. I think, though, that the term has been used at different times in the United States for different things. In the criminal world, it has frequently been used as a last appeal by prisoners both in state and federal courts. When they've exhausted all their other remedies, they will bring a federal habeas corpus action to get federal court review after a state conviction.
So that's the whole point of it, is like, hey, I've been convicted of this, but now I want the feds to look at it.
Yes, and you'll see that frequently on death penalty litigation and stuff. That's probably been its most common usage in the last 50 years or so. At different times, however, it has been used in different forums. It was subject to litigation after 9/11, when some of the people were taken or rounded up and taken to Guantanamo.
But it wasn't suspended, I don't think.
Well, I believe the government did try to, I don't think it was officially suspended.
Okay.
But it was a question of, do they have the right to habeas corpus because they weren't on U.S. soil, but they were enemy combatants, even though war was never officially declared. So it gets into, for a relatively short sentence, it does incorporate a lot of different rights, but it's basically the ability to ask whoever the government is, and they're holding somebody in detention, to justify their basis for holding them.
Right, and so that kind of leads me to the next thing, which there is such a thing called the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. It's based in New York City. And their explanation of it I thought was really good. The doctrine of habeas corpus is the right of any person under arrest to appear in person before the court to ensure that they haven't been falsely accused. The U.S. Constitution specifically protects this right in Article 1, Section 9, which we've heard more about Article 1, Section 9 in the last week or so than we ever had before. And it's called the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Why did our founding fathers want this? Well, according to what I have found on the internet, it says the framers of the Constitution were deeply concerned about the potential for unchecked executive power, particularly after their experiences with British rule. And of course, they supposedly had the same rights as British citizens when we had colonies. However, it wasn't always the case. There were a lot of liberties taken. I know you're more of a scholar of American history than I am, if you want to comment on that.
Well, I think that's one of the reactions after the Revolutionary War. It's like Article 3 of the Bill of Rights does not allow the government to put soldiers in your house. You can't commandeer somebody's home to put soldiers in, because the British had done that to the United States. A lot of the...
Did they put that one in because of the War of 1812? Or did that precede it?
That was preceding.
Okay.
They were part of the original Bill of Rights. So there are a lot of things that may not be overly relevant today, but were important at the time because of what were felt to be British abuses of the colonists.
Oh, I'm sure. Actually, my family fought on the side of the rebels, so I guess that gives some explanation for my personality. But
well, and the other times that it's been used, probably the most famous time when it was suspended was during the Civil War.
Right.
There had been litigation previously about Congress's doing laws on that and invoking it. And President Lincoln apparently suspended it without Congress. Now later Congress, I think in 1863, validated that and had a very extensive law regarding suspension of habeas.
I was going to get to the New York Times article that appeared yesterday because they literally wrote an article that is what is habeas corpus, and said that actually it's Congress that has to suspend it. So, but this is really exciting. Just this week, they found a copy of the Magna Carta. It's an original. I guess apparently there are like 7 original copies. I shouldn't even say copies. 7 original Magna Carta charters. And some of the language there, people historians try and say that was the beginning of habeas corpus. Actually, it wasn't. It was 1166, which I would love for you to indulge me in that too. But here is the phrase from the Magna Carta that I love so much. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled. Now you got to remember, Robin Hood got exiled, all right? That's why he was an outlaw. Or outlawed. Okay, where was I? Or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. And in the Latin, they use the word aliquem to mean anyone. So when you had a free man in England, they owned their own land. They were free. You also had the serfs or the villeins who were allowed to buy their freedom, but it didn't always work so well. I'd say, oh, wait a minute, you didn't quite give me enough money, that type of thing. But aliquem means anyone. And if you speak any Spanish, you'll know that there is a word alguien, which means anyone. Just thought that was so interesting. So it wasn't just freemen, it was everyone. And another favorite passage that shows you what might have been going on back in the day. No legal officer shall start proceedings against anyone on his own mere say-so, without reliable witnesses having been brought for the purpose. So when you have an authoritarian government, somebody can just denounce you, like in World War II. Wasn't that going on? I mean, if the Gestapo wanted to denounce somebody, or a French citizen denounced another one, maybe they wanted to get him out of the way, maybe their business partner they didn't like before the war, you know, that type of thing, they could dénoncer. And, you know, there was no habeas corpus. So I guess it kind of shows how important it is. What do you think?
Well, I think it's also, it kind of goes along with other parts of the Constitution. I think last time we talked about the Fourth Amendment and that nobody could be held without an indictment or upon probable cause showing. It's kind of the same principle under as a foundational element that there, and this also gets into the use of the term due process, where there must be some legal proceeding before the government does something or takes some drastic action. And habeas corpus is more directly related to somebody in detention, but we're seeing a lot of this discussion on due process that gets into the current immigration debate, and a lot of these lawsuits challenging many of the executive orders that the president has made in the last couple of months. So on one hand, you can really dive into some really boring legal distinctions, but I think if you think of it in terms that almost everything has some level of due process requirement, and that's where it's very hard to describe, and I think that's the basis for a lot of this litigation that's going on, is because different laws have different levels of due process.
Well, wait a minute. Where are these different laws coming from?
Well, from Congress.
Okay.
But think of it, to kind of simplify it,
Okay.
I think if you think about the traditional criminal justice system, what's our standard of proof? What do I as a prosecutor have to prove to convict somebody of a crime?
Probable cause.
No, more than probable cause. What do we say?
They say in England, they say reasonable suspicion.
No, that's just to bring charges.
Okay.
Or maybe to get a search warrant.
All right, you better tell us, because we're stumped.
You've been in court enough. What do they always say in court? We have to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond all doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right.
Not beyond a shadow of a doubt, a reasonable doubt. We spend an awful lot of time in closing arguments trying to explain that to juries so they understand what that is. And that is, in American jurisprudence, probably the highest standard. Now, there's another very common standard, clear and convincing evidence, that's used in a lot of civil cases. And then there's another one called a preponderance of the evidence, that means just more than half.
And do you use that like when there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, like you don't have the murder weapon?
It doesn't mean the quality of your evidence or the type of your evidence. It means the standard of proof that you must meet to get the result that you're asking for. So in an interstate extradition, for example, if we think somebody killed somebody in Tennessee and we file paperwork to extradite them, or somebody's being held here for a crime in another state, the level of proof we have to do to extradite them back to the other state is merely to prove that the person they're requesting is that person. We have to prove ID. We don't have to prove anything about the underlying facts of the case, as long as there is a valid warrant coming from, and it's called getting a governor's warrant. So it's gone through the process in that state. They've sent their warrant from the governor to us, and all we're doing is verifying that the person we're holding is that person. So it's another legal action, but what we have to prove is a much lower burden, in that we're just showing that he did it, or that he is the person they are looking for, not that he did the crime that they're charging him with. And this is where I think with the immigration, can be very confusing in some of these other situations, because we've got all these different types of immigration status. People are here under refugee status. People are here because of They've declared certain areas or countries, almost by definition, if you're from this country, you are put in a certain category. So when we talk about who is getting deported and what level of due process they're owed, we're getting into these, and I can't say that I know immigration law, but each of these different categories may have a different due process standard or burden of proof that the government has to bring to in order to affect
but, I mean,
the
wouldn't
remedy.
it all go back to this habeas corpus, that yes, they are allowed to go in front of a judge?
Okay. But habeas corpus doesn't necessarily, it's bringing you to the fact, are you being held legally? And what the state generally on those has to do is show a valid conviction, if it's a criminal type of case.
But these people who are being deported, supposedly they haven't been convicted here.
Well, it's not a conviction necessarily. They probably haven't been prosecuted for illegally entering. But if they are found in that status, and this is where, without seeing exactly what the immigration statutes say and what they say the basis is to remove somebody from the country, it is very hard to discuss these because nobody is telling us what that burden of proof is. What due process is required? The gentleman from Maryland who was supposedly sent by mistake. Well, is it is it a mistake that we have the wrong guy? Is it a mistake that he hasn't done some of these other things, or he didn't fit under the definition of who they were looking at that point? Could he be deported for other reasons, and should he be subject to that? So that's where I think it's very difficult for the media to climb into this without knowing exactly what that due process or burden of proof or standard of proof that the government has to prove, which makes it, I think, very confusing for the general public to try to understand who's right and who's wrong on this. And then you toss in the forum shopping that was actually the subject of, it was presented under the birthright citizenship argument last week in the court, but a large part of that was just discussing whether the individual district trial court judge has the ability to put an injunction out that affects the whole country, and whether those should there be some limitation on that. Is there a discussion on knocking out an entire law? Should it only apply to the litigants that are in front of that court? Should it be limited to major constitutional violations? I mean, there's a lot of questions that I think the Supreme Court is eventually going to have to answer. But all of this is kind of under
citizenship thing.
But it's, well, and I think that's going to impact a lot of these other things. And even going back, if you go back to the past administration, when President Biden suspended student loans by executive order,
right?
And then Republicans went to a favorable district court and got an injunction to stop that. I mean, both sides have been doing this. Is kind of a relatively not new, but it's become much more common in the last 15 years.
Yeah. We're all on a crazy rock and roll ride with this one. I just have to go back to that habeas corpus does pertain to citizens and non-citizens.
Persons.
So when they took Kilmar, people were aghast because they were saying, hey, wait a minute, you know. So anyway, I did want to say something here too. I love this one. In 1305, apparently, the king, well, no, I don't even know who the king was in 1305 in England, but it says the king, I do know in 1166, all right, and I'm getting to that one. But in 1305, I just love this because we don't hear this, you know, in the U.S. The king is at all times entitled to have an account why the liberty of any of his subjects is restrained wherever that restraint may be inflicted. So, and this was after the big fight that Henry II had with Thomas à Becket. If you will remember that, I'm going to take you all the way back to 1166 now. And would you stop laughing? All right, I'm going to give you a second.
1305, I remember it well.
Oh, yeah, it was like right around the corner.
Who won the World Series that year? I can't remember.
I think they were having jousting tournaments at that point, but it's said that the habeas corpus stems from the Assize of Clarendon in 1166. So why did they have to have this in 1166? This was prior to the Magna Carta, when they dragged King John, who was well, never mind. He's in all the Robin Hood as the evil one, right? Because there was a big mess. They had a civil war. Mm-hmm. Okay, and there were two rival people going for the throne prior to 1166. There were some questions on land ownership. There were also these Flemish mercenaries roaming around England and robbing and thieving and doing all sorts of bad stuff because they hadn't been paid. So they needed to do something with them. And also land ownership was a big thing. So Henry II wanted more control over the courts, but the church had its own courts. So that's where the battle ensued. And so he decided that he would set up this Assize of Clarendon to take care of people with murder and some of the major ones. And then he set up roving courts that would go from shire to shire or whatever. And they'd get 12 free men to judge the other people or say if somebody had committed a crime. Before that, you might have been tried by ordeal. And if you didn't pass the water test, or if you died because, the flames, suffocated you, must be guilty. So the trial by jury started in 1166. It didn't happen right away. So we have Henry II, one of my heroes, even though he was ruthless, to thank for the trial by jury. I know you guys are all cracking up over this, but I just really love this stuff. So anyway, on to, I guess I could bring up the New York Times, because I have seen it on TV. Also, maybe, Mike, we should talk about the general misperception of what habeas corpus is, because you're the one that brought up Kristi Noem, who said it gave the president the right to deport people.
Well, and I think that also shows the complexity of how this is used and the discussions, because as we talked during the Civil War, when, as you might expect, in a civil war, and in many wars, if you're fighting another country with a different language, it is difficult to invade somebody else and pass for a native and be a spy. But within a civil war where everybody looks the same, everybody talks the same, it would be much easier to infiltrate.
Yeah, you can maybe tell who was who.
And as people forget how Washington, D.C. was virtually surrounded by secessionist states. So they were in jeopardy a lot. And I think that's why Lincoln suspended habeas corpus at that point.
He said the Confederates were about to march on Washington.
But I read that they were picking people up on the basis of Secretary Seward send a telegram, I think this guy's a spy, pick him up. And so there were some potential abuses, but there were also real danger.
Right.
So it was used that way then. I think you referenced that it was used in early World War II in Hawaii, where you had a very large Japanese population. That was one of your examples, I think.
He said that it was suspended 4 times, most recently in 1941 in Hawaii after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And aren't you reading a book about that?
Yeah, I'm just reading a book about how that was. And this book, at least, is very, I think, saying that the people that live from Japanese that lived in Hawaii were actually very loyal to the United States. They were there by choice, and partially because the Japanese had instituted some pretty severe draft requirements and had already invaded China, and so
And we should say that Hawaii wasn't a state yet.
right, didn't become a state till 1959. But we had major military bases there. I mean, that's why they attacked Pearl Harbor and Ford Field and that. So there were some really potentially good reasons. That was also at a time when not too long after that, mainly in California, where even American citizens of Japanese descent were put into camps. And that is probably considered, in retrospect, one of the black marks on President Roosevelt's legacy by many civil libertarians.
Did they get habeas corpus, or were they just rounded up?
I think they were rounded up. Now, there may have been some level of judicial review before they went in.
That's where you come into people being denounced, you know, and then you're thrown into a concentration camp.
But again, you don't know what level of review that was. Are you Japanese? Yes, okay.
There you go. Yeah, and I mean, there might have been, they probably had papers of some sort back in the day, but...
Well, and I think that's another thing to remember if you're talking about immigration, that the laws didn't really come into play for a long time. I mean, this country was around for a while. We welcomed virtually all
we
immigrants.
needed immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, that's what settled.
Actually, we kind of do now, but...
Well, it's what settled the West and filled in elsewhere. So some of these things, it's good to look at a historical context, but it also recognized that the circumstances change over time. And that's something about the Constitution, that it is and has managed to be a living document for 230 some years. And it will probably still go on. But this is where it also is very much open to debate. We see that in the Second Amendment debate. Certainly there were no semi-automatic weapons in 1776 or 1789 like we have today.
Yeah.
We have technology that they could not have imagined back then. So trying to fit some of those unique needs. Right now, the debate about how are we going to regulate or AI, it's something that concerns me in the legal system, of how are we going to distinguish truth from fact and authenticate evidence. Some of the biggest help we've had in criminal prosecution recently are videos that are produced through surveillance cameras, Ring doorbells, those kind of things. If we can't authenticate them in court, that's going to be a real problem going forward.
Yes.
So
you get one of these fancy lawyers.
So, but it just shows you that
from Indianapolis,
the law frequently trails whatever your technology is or your changes in society. And it's usually a little slow to catch up. And when you have something going on like we have right now with a president that is being very aggressive on his approach to the federal government with executive orders, and it's creating a ton of litigation, you know, how quickly will it take for the Supreme Court to take these up? Many times a case of constitutional import can take a decade or more from getting the right test case and running it through all the appeal processes to bring it up to the Supreme Court.
I know, it's happening so fast that it makes your head spin. And so that's why I think habeas corpus has been such a hot topic. Who would have ever thought? You know, I'm seeing it on TV and on cable news. I'm seeing it in the New York Times. New York Times also says that habeas corpus was suspended during the Reconstruction, that would have been after the Civil War, in an effort to stop violence by the Ku Klux Klan. Never heard that before. And in 1905 in the Philippines, when it was a U.S. territory and there was a rebellion against the American military. So I can kind of see that. Those are very specific times. It's not like a sweeping thing like the entire nation, but the Ku Klux Klan was a dangerous bunch of individuals. So there's some question too about what it was like in colonial times here, and I pulled something on that up, and if everybody got the same rights, and but where is it? I know it's here. Just bear with me if you want.
Well, this is another example, though, that I think the rights that we consider today are so enhanced from what they were 200 years ago.
Now, what do you mean by that?
Um,
Couldn't go out and get yourself a lawyer back then?
Well, I think you look at different aspects. I mean, when our country was settled, who was the first person a community hired? They hired a sheriff.
They did.
They wanted law and order, or they wanted order probably before they wanted law. A great entertaining movie that kind of shows this turn of the century between the 1800s and 1900s is if you ever watch Paul Newman and The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean, that this guy kind of appoints himself as the judge, and it kind of follows the settlement of the town, and as it becomes civilized. I mean, on one hand, it's a very funny movie, but in another way, it does kind of show how you go from a frontier, the law is whoever the strongest person is.
Right.
Right makes right, or right, well, can't talk right now. Might makes right.
Exactly.
But it traces that from kind of a frontier town to a civilized town that's more supportive of families, and they add additional rights to people.
And fairness.
Judge Roy Bean, just hang him.
And
He
you
said,
hear
well, that's
that these
against the
days.
law. And he'd say, well, that looks like a bad law. And he ripped it out of the book.
Oh, right.
So when I say that our system of jurisprudence and protections have developed to safeguard defendants' rights tremendously. Go back and read about how quickly some of the major crimes, even from 100 years ago, when they occurred, to when somebody was convicted, to when somebody was executed, when the death penalty was used much more.
Public hangings.
You might get all of that done in less than a year. And now it takes 20 years with all the appellate rights that are out there. So I'm just saying that almost every defendant these days, and sometimes when people criticize the criminal justice system, that it hasn't improved or something, I don't know if it's an improvement or not for the average citizen, but for the defendant, they have much greater protections. Almost any case, any criminal conviction can be appealed, and frequently are appealed.
They might be appealed, but will they be accepted?
Well, maybe not, but maybe they don't deserve to be accepted.
I mean, this is what I saw in the French court. I got to tell you, the French Court of Appeals in Caen, there was one case that absolutely cracked me up. This guy who was very aggressive, here he is in the Court of Appeals, and he was accused of stealing wood from the communal forest. And he said that he was just cleaning it up and it was laying on the side of the road. But he was also accused of beating up this old lady who had her field next to his. And the husband who was in the car, who couldn't walk very well, saw it. And I just thought, how did this case make it to the actual Court of Appeals? It just doesn't seem that, important enough. Oh, you stole wood from the communal forest. It just seems like, some dinky little village in Normandy. So I don't see those kind of cases being appealed. I mean, they can, but they have to be accepted, do they not?
Well, It depends on what your standard is and when that was. Different things at different times in different communities. If that's the basis of survival, the community woodpile is the source of fuel in the winter. And
We're talking about today, this year.
I don't know these communities. It seems a little excessive for us, but there can be, I've seen some weird cases that still go on, and humans can argue about a lot of different things. But
It was bizarre.
Taking you back to past history, stealing somebody's horse was a big deal.
Well, yeah, it was transportation, like stealing somebody's car today.
Yeah. So some of these things happen. The community, the society responds to what its greatest needs are. And I think when you look at the history of laws and how they evolve, you have to take that into consideration as to what was important to them at the time.
So I guess what we can say is that we've sort of established that even though we know exactly what habeas corpus says, it is not all that easy to apply to today's situation.
Well, I think it's because it's strictly, basically, you got to be in detention. I think where it gets complicated in today's society is who's putting you in detention, who is being put into detention, what is the basis for seizing them, which is why we're now seeing these First Amendment challenges to, I think, the student at Columbia, and there was another student at Tufts University, that they're making the argument that these people haven't been part of a rebellion. They have, the civil libertarians are saying they're speaking out, they're expressing their First Amendment rights to speak their minds. And the government is responding and seizing them. Is that violating any of these immigration statutes or the Alien Sedition Act of 1798 or whatever it is? And it's ironic to me, sometimes people say, oh, they're relying on this 18th century law. Well,
that's hardly ever been used.
Well, what's the Constitution?
Well, yeah.
When was it written? So
a long time ago.
Well, I agree, and your laws can look very archaic that way, but our system is still built on what the Constitution was ratified in 1788 or 87, 88, 89, and we're still trying to bend it and mold it and interpret it to fit today. And if some of these other laws are still on the books, you can make a good case that a legislative body should go in and periodically review what they've done to see, is it still necessary? Is it still applicable? Have the times passed it by? Maybe every law should have a sunset provision on it to avoid those kind of accusations that we're trying to enforce things that aren't really relevant, or we're taking the words certainly from a much different context than what they were originally established.
It's been much different lately. And the New York Times says that it's the executive branch, which includes the President and Justice Department, cannot suspend habeas corpus. Only Congress can. This comes from a Professor Lacroix. She might be from the University of Chicago, the New York Times, but which spells out the powers of Congress. Habeas corpus can be suspended when, in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it, which is what I read before. Mm-hmm. And so it really is up to the Congress. So we're living in a sort of a whiplash situation here. We just don't know where it's going to come.
Was there ever a judicial finding that Lincoln violated the Constitution?
He was heavily criticized for it.
I
I
can think of many presidents that have been heavily criticized, but he was really in the Civil War. I mean, we can't
minimize what he was going through. And the suspension of habeas corpus was one of Lincoln's most controversial decisions. And then in the spring of 1863, General Ambrose Burnside, from which we got the word sideburns, arrested Peace Democrat Clement Vallandigham, who had been critical of the U.S. government, and banned publication of the Chicago Times, which was supportive of that man. So here you have somebody who was suppressing, although Lincoln defended himself against charges that his administration had subverted the Constitution, and then he did lift Burnside's order suppressing the Chicago Times. So they didn't take away freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I mean, they were...
Although I did read that some of the military districts during the Civil War did take newspaper editors and imprison them. I found an article that had a couple of those in it.
How cheerful.
Yeah. Well.
How very cheerful, going after journalists.
And again, our sense of the protection of some of those amendments is much greater today than it was 150 years ago.
Well, let's hope it stays that way. So I'm going to give you the last word, because we have really talked about habeas corpus. I think it's been personally fascinating. And, like I said, it's been discussed on every news show that I'm putting on lately. So would you like to say anything before I sign off? And remind everybody where they can see this.
Well, again, I think I'd just like to reiterate that when all of these terms get talked about, you need to have them in the right context. And for the most part, we don't have them in the right context. We don't know what that level of due process is to deport different categories of people. We don't know under some of these acts how valid they still are. That's why we're seeing these injunctions happen, but it's also why we're getting these court decisions. This judge says this judge says that.
Dizzying.
Is it all politics? I mean, are they going to, it seems like the Trump people are trying to go to Trump judges to get a decision. The other side is going to people appointed by Biden or Obama or Clinton. And how much of this it's just so hard for the general public and anybody who's not reading those exact statutes to know how this is actually going. That's why as a society, let's not get so worked up. Recognize that due process is alive and well.
Good.
That people are going to court to determine these things. This is not a constitutional crisis. This is what our Constitution was designed for, to take care of these differences between the legislative branch and the executive branch. There's many of this stuff that I personally think if we had a more functional Congress that was willing to compromise on some things, we might have some laws that made a little more sense. And we really haven't revised immigration laws in almost 40 years. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of this stuff that the system is working. This is what it was designed to do.
That is powerful and positive.
It's just hard, I think, for the general public to watch this because it seems like such a back and forth. Today, this federal judge says this. Tomorrow, a different federal judge says something else. Right. And it goes to an appellate court. Eventually, a lot of this will find its way to the Supreme Court and we'll get some kind of resolution. But it may take several years to get that done.
Yeah, and the New York Times sort of spelled out like all these things that have happened lately. All right, well, I hope, and Mike hopes, that you have enjoyed the probable cause today. I think we did have a great discussion on what habeas corpus is and what it means to the American people, whether you're citizens or non-citizens at this point. You can find this on www.theprobablecause.com. And by the way, yes, we are on Spotify and Apple now, so if you don't want to see us, you can listen to us. So this has been The Probable Cause. Goodbye until next time. This episode is filmed and edited by Frosty Pictures. The Probable Cause is produced by Maumee Media.
Worried when I crossed the Michigan line, a cop from Steuben County waiting on I-69. A headlamp went out while he pulled me over. Charged me with possession after I rolled down the window.
Now that's skunk.
Indians a trick when it comes to weed. It's like who doesn't smoke or use gummies? Your grandpa, your brother, your rich friend from school? Hell, throw in the whole courthouse and my attorney too. It's time those assholes change these stupid laws. It ain't worth the paper for a probable cause. Sitting on a bar stool in my usual place, this guy next to me said he was looking for some cocaine. Well, I just sold him an 8-ball with a little piece off for me. But my buyer was a cop? Should have known he was a creep. So I'm a dealer, right? You gotta be kidding. It's a rich man's drug. I just take it because I'm injured. 8 years in Westville with a monkey on my back. There's more drugs in here than you can shake a shank at. One dirty drug test, man, this system's flawed. Undercover screwed me in my probable cause. Street crimes never did me no favors. I'm hooked on Fetty. I'm a junkie, not a felon. Told that son of a bitch on the way to lockup. I can't seem to shake it. I need help, not mocking. What do you want from someone who's been through the system? Drugs all through the house before mom and dad went to prison. Throw me in jail and give me a fine? Someday I'll be dead and away from your kind. Now I'm at the courthouse in front of a judge. Can't say my public defender cares for me much. Crimes are committed on both sides of the law. God help me now with this probable cause. C shift never gets old. Anything can happen when you're out on patrol. You think I'm just eating donuts, man? Give me a break. Nothing on this job is a piece of cake. Lights and sirens activated. This knucklehead wants to chase. Baby mama at the scene just spit in my face. Wife's worried that someday I won't be pulling up at all. You'll read about my killer in a probable cause. She went through my phone and she seen my text. I told her forget it. It was just my ex. She took a swing and knocked me flat. Man, I went wild and hit her back. Judge slapped me with a no contact order. Now she's got the kids and she's staying with her mother. So she started it all and I have to take the fall. You can read my whole story in the probable cause. When I was young, caught a case for dealing and did my time. Yeah, I got a record, but I was doing fine. Running my own business on the southeast side. Yeah, I got a gun. I kept it on hand. Told the cop my reason, thought he'd understand. In this neighborhood, you need some protection. Attorney thought I could get just community corrections, but the judge decided to send me to prison. Can't get ahead no matter how hard I try. Read the probable cause, it'll make you cry.
Whispers and rumors that don't get reported. Stories I write that are often distorted. Got my notebook and pen, and I'm ready to listen. Tell me the truth, I'll consider your position. I've seen killers with eyes so cold and dead, and others go to prison because of what someone said, rotting away for the rest of their lives, leaving a hole here on the outside. Things are sad here on earth, and it's no wonder why, when you consider the sociopaths who remain in charge. It's me who sees the system for all its flaws, and I usually start with the probable cause. My right hand is reading the probable cause.